Candyman. Candyman. Candyman.
With the new Candyman out in theaters, I thought now was as good a time as any to go and look back at the horror cult classic that is the original, and the story that inspired it. And yes, we are going to look at the travesties that are the sequels, but we'll get to those later. Now, if you're a fan of Candyman, or you've just watched the opening credits, you know that the film is based on a short story written by Clive Barker. This story, called The Forbidden, is part of an anthology collection of short horror stories all written by Barker, called The Books of Blood. Now, the film isn't that much of a deviation from the short story. They both have a main character named Helen, they both have Candyman, or something like it. They both take place in sort of a rundown part of town, although the short story takes place in Liverpool rather than Candyman's Chicago. Before the Books of Blood series, Barker was probably best known for being a playwright from Liverpool. But in 1980, Barker read the book Dark Forces, an anthology of 23 short horror stories from authors like Stephen King and Ray Bradbury. Impressed by the versatility shown in Dark Forces, Barker decided to put on 23 different hats and create an anthology series of his own in order to express a wider range of ideas. Because it wasn't likely that Books of Blood would do well commercially, Barker had no reason to hold back, showing no signs of doing any self-censorship at all. Barker even said, "I like to use the term celebration in the kind of work I do. I like to think that there's a kind of celebration of perversity in the volumes of Books of Blood. That's a response simply to normality. What I cannot bear is normality. What I'm trying to upset is not something hugely repressive, but something hugely banal. That is, the lives most people live." In the long term, these books would be insanely influential, of course spawning Candyman, which is the reason we're talking about it today. To Barker's surprise, The Books of Blood was not only met with commercial success, but even other iconic writers at the time, who Barker himself admired, gave the book huge props. People like Peter Straub, David Morrell, and Stephen King, who described Barker as being the future of horror fiction. So now with the Books of Blood's success, where does Candyman come in all of this? When talking about films being made from his stories, Barker said, "I'm concerned that the filmmakers be willing to be true to the source material, with all that implies, in terms of graphicness, its desire to distress, disturb, and subvert." So given what Barker said, would he approve of Candyman? Yeah, he would. But before Candyman could happen, the director, Bernard Rose, or Bernie as his friends call him, was already set to direct one of Clive Barker's other short stories called In the Flesh. Now Bernie liked the screenplay for the adaptation, but didn't think it would work on a technical level. So instead, Bernie found another one of Barker's stories, The Forbidden, and went to Propaganda Films producer Steve Gollin. From there, a deal was made and the project began. It was here where Bernie switched the setting from Liverpool to Cabrini Green in Chicago, and Candyman from a white man to a black man. Also, fortunately, Clive Barker would also be working on set as an executive producer. Barker himself has said that Bernie did an excellent job adapting the short story to the big screen and trusted him from the very beginning. This is because Barker saw Bernie's other movie, Paper House, which he called a very intelligent movie. Because of this trust, there was never any conflict on set between Bernie and Barker. Having dealt with annoying producers who stuck their hand in everything on previous films, Barker decided to take a more relaxed approach, merely remaining present on the production, allowing Bernie to do whatever he wanted with the film. Although, if he ever needed help or advice, Barker would be there to lend a hand or share his opinion. Now, as I'm sure you know, conflict on a divided set always makes for a better movie.
Now don't just be sorry, think for one fucking second. The fuck are you doing?
So under that assumption, Candyman must have sucked. Well, not exactly. In fact, Candyman outperformed expectations at the box office. This was a surprise, not only because it was a low-budget horror movie, but because it was a low priority for the studio, it wasn't even promoted that much. Regardless, the success of Candyman prompted Steve Gollin to propose that Bernard Rose make a sequel. So with that, Bernie couldn't help but agree. A little side note, Steve Gollin actually hated doing Candyman from the very beginning and thought it was a bad idea. But once the money started rolling in... Now between the release of the first Candyman and the production of the second, something happened. Bernard Rose was pushed out as a director, Clive Barker was never going to be directly involved, almost all the actors were going to be gone from the first one, except for Tony Todd, who made his return as Candyman, So what happened between the first one and the second one? Well, if you're assuming that the director and the producers had a disagreement, you'd be correct. Bernie's idea for the second film was very different. Titled Candyman 2: The Midnight Meat Train, almost nothing was the same. The film would take place in modern London, where the Jack the Ripper killings start back up again. The protagonist, a British policewoman, investigates the murders and uncovers secrets that tie them to the British elite. As she does this, the people around her, including the police force and her husband, gaslight her. The climax of the film would be loosely derived from one of Barker's other stories in the Books of Blood, the Midnight Meat Train. In Bernie's film, the train is filled with hanging dead bodies and travels to a secret train station under Buckingham Palace. This station leads to a banquet hall, where the British elite are seen feasting upon the bodies of the poor.
I do love the smell of the hunt.
After the protagonist figures everything out, they cut out her tongue to prevent her from telling the truth. In the end, she then becomes the next Ripper. Candyman was only name-dropped in the script one time, only in comparison to the Ripper. So what I want you to do is go down to the comments section and tell me exactly what you think Steve Gallen said to Bernie after he heard this idea. Did you do it? You want the answer? Here's the answer. Steve Gallen looked him in the eye and said, "You're absolutely insane." Now, there are a couple of reasons why Steve might say something like that. For one, Candyman's not in the movie. Candyman isn't in Candyman 2. Not only that, but the film directly attacks the royal family. At this point, no progress was being made on the sequel, so Steve Gallen pushed out Bernie as the director and brought in Bill Condon to do the job. And thus, the result was disappointment. It sucked. The year is 2003. After the success of Freddy vs. Jason, someone went to the studio that owned the rights to both Candyman and Leprechaun and proposed to do a crossover movie, Candyman vs. Leprechaun. Candyman vs. Leprechaun. According to Bernard Rose, this was seriously being considered by the producers until Tony Todd himself came in and said, "I saw it and I said, I will never be involved in something like that. I respect the character." 5 years after the failure of the third movie, Tony Todd and Clive Barker would come together to talk about the making of a fourth installment, one that would take place at a women's college in a snowy New England setting. Little planning was done, however, and the project remained in limbo for nearly 20 years because of disputes between the owners of the rights to the Candyman franchise. Candyman actor Tony Todd said of the fourth installment, "I didn't have enough juice to fight the fact that the owners were feuding. There were 3 factions that owned the film, and they all hated each other, and nobody would give power to the other people to do anything." That's what held it up pretty much, for 20 years. With an apparent $25 million budget, the fourth installment would have Candyman as a college professor after having cut off his hook arm, thus removing the curse. However, after something horrific happens to his students, he gives in to his compulsions and returns as a one-armed Candyman. With a relatively hefty $25 million budget, matched with the fact that the previous 2 films didn't do well at all, this seemed unlikely to happen. For context, the first 2 Candyman movies had budgets of $6 million each. The third, $3 million. There's no way that anything like that would ever. While it is technically a completely different movie from the one Tony Todd talked about, the new Candyman movie still boasts a $25 million budget. Although, with a name such as Jordan Peele attached to the project, even just as an executive producer, the movie was far more likely to succeed. And fortunately, even for a pandemic release, it did. On opening weekend, Candyman was able to gross $22 million. At the time of recording this, it sits at over $62 million. The director, Nia DaCosta, is also the very first black woman to have directed a film and made it to the #1 spot in the box office. So, that's where we are today. Personally, I can't wait to see what's next for the franchise. I kinda wonder if one of Bernard Rose's ideas will ever get to see the light of day.
Candyman.
I guess we'll see you in the next one. Candyman 5.
Candyman. Candyman.
Wait.